The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with the usual July humidity, a restless energy that clung to the city like damp cloth. Inside the congressional hearing room, though, the atmosphere felt sharper, colder, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The room wasn't grand, just a functional space with a long oak table, rows of chairs packed tight, and a low hum of murmured conversations. Aides lined the edges, their notebooks open, pens poised. A handful of reporters, lucky enough to slip past the no-camera rule, scribbled furiously, their eyes darting between the panelists and the woman who had just entered the room, Ivanka Trump. She walked with a measured grace, heels clicking softly against the linoleum, her beige blouse and navy skirt tailored to perfection. Every strand of hair was in place, her smile polite but restrained, as if she'd practiced it 1,000 times in front of a mirror. She was here for an ethics review hearing, a procedural affair meant to stay quiet, out of the headlines. No live feeds, no prepared speeches, just the slow grind of government at work. But the moment she stepped to the podium, the room shifted. Something was coming. At the far end of the table sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, her gray suit sharp but understated, her notes neatly stacked in front of her. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, her hands loosely clasped. She hadn't moved when Ivanka's name was called, hadn't flinched as the chair, Representative Marcus Hale from Ohio, tapped the microphone and announced, "Ivanka Trump, you may address the panel." The room stirred. Third-party submissions were rare, and the name Ivanka Trump carried weight. Eyes flicked toward Jasmine, who remained still, her gaze fixed on the edge of the table. Marcus cleared his throat. "We've received a submission from a third-party participant, deemed relevant by committee vote," he said, his voice steady but laced with the faintest curiosity. Ivanka adjusted the microphone, her movements deliberate. "Good afternoon," she began, her tone smooth, practiced. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I want to start by acknowledging the importance of ethical integrity in public service. It's not about party lines, it's about trust." A few panelists nodded, their faces neutral. She paused, letting the words settle, then continued, her voice dipping slightly. "With that in mind, I feel compelled to express my concern about Representative Jasmine Crockett." The air tightened. Heads turned, some subtly, others less so. Ivanka didn't look at Jasmine, her eyes fixed on the panel. "I believe her recent conduct shows a pattern of reckless behavior, performative aggression, and language that falls short of the standard we expect from this body. Public service demands passion, yes, but it also demands restraint. I question whether Representative Crockett demonstrates the measured leadership required for her role." A faint cough broke the silence from the left side of the room. Representative Daniel Carver from Idaho leaned forward, his lips pressed tight, suddenly attentive. Others shifted uncomfortably, their chairs creaking. Jasmine, though, didn't move. Her face remained calm, her posture unchanged, as if Ivanka's words were just background noise. Ivanka pressed on. In recent months, she has made inflammatory comments, used social media to escalate tensions, and repeatedly undermined bipartisan efforts by refusing to engage respectfully with those who disagree. This isn't about politics. It's about fitness to serve. Her voice softened, a practiced touch of sincerity. "I respect the work this committee does, but I urge you to consider whether such behavior erodes public trust in ways we cannot afford." With that, she thanked the panel, stepped back from the podium, and returned to her seat at the rear. The room exhaled, but only slightly. All eyes turned to Jasmine. Her name hadn't been listed for questioning today. Her team had no warning Ivanka would appear, no chance to prepare. Yet her eyes lifted, steady and clear, as she opened her binder with a soft click. "Chairman Hale," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "May I respond?" The room froze. Marcus gave a single nod, his face unreadable. "You may," he said. Jasmine stood slowly, her heels barely whispering against the floor as she approached the podium. She didn't shuffle papers or adjust the microphone. She just stood there, her gaze sweeping the room, calm but piercing. "I didn't come here to speak today," she began, her voice steady, deliberate. But I also didn't come here to be lied about. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly hushed. She let the words hang, her tone calm, not defensive. I've sat in this seat for nearly 3 hours, listening to discussions about accountability, transparency, truth. And now, without warning, I'm accused of being unfit for office by someone who doesn't even serve in this chamber. A few heads turned toward Ivanka, who sat perfectly still, hands clasped in her lap. Jasmine paused, her fingers resting lightly on the podium. Let's be real. This isn't about ethics. This is about image, narrative control. I know the pattern. A black woman who speaks with passion, who calls things as they are, suddenly becomes aggressive or unfit. That's an old trick in a new suit. Chairman Hale raised an eyebrow, but stayed silent. I've disagreed with colleagues on both sides, Jasmine continued. I've raised my voice. I've said things that made people uncomfortable. That doesn't make me reckless. It makes me honest. Her voice carried that unmistakable clarity, the kind that didn't need volume to command attention. But since we're talking about fitness, I like to offer some clarity. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small, cracked iPhone. Holding it up, she said, "This phone contains a voicemail I received 2 months ago. It's from a mutual contact, someone both Ms. Trump and I know personally. In it, she left a message, unfiltered, unrehearsed." She turned to the panel. I asked permission to play this audio. It's under 45 seconds. Afterward, I'll say my piece and sit down. The room hesitated. Playing a personal recording wasn't standard procedure, but it wasn't explicitly against the rules. Marcus glanced at the legal counsel seated behind him. A quick whisper and nod. "You may proceed," he said. Jasmine handed the phone to the tech at the side of the room. He plugged it into the audio system, adjusted the volume. A faint pop, then a voice filled the room. "I know she makes people nervous, but Jasmine's the real deal. She's one of the only ones up there actually fighting for people. Not headlines, not donors. She's fierce. I wish more were like her." It was Ivanka's voice, warm, unguarded, laced with respect. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one looked at Ivanka. Jasmine didn't smile or gloat. She stepped back to the podium, her voice steady. "That message wasn't meant for me. It was meant for someone else. But they shared it because they knew this moment would come." Her tone dipped, just slightly. It always comes when the truth doesn't fit the script. She paused, letting the words settle. "You don't have to like my tone. You don't have to like how I vote or how I speak. But you do have to respect that I show up, that I work, that I fight for my district, that I don't fold when someone throws dirt just to see if it sticks." The room shifted, the tension turning inward, reflective. I'm not here to clap back or perform. I'm here to remind this room that truth still matters, even when it's inconvenient. She turned to Marcus. "I yield." And with that, she returned to her seat, her movements calm, deliberate. The room didn't breathe. Not yet. For a moment, there was nothing. No rustling papers, no nervous coughs, just a tight, unfamiliar quiet. Marcus stared ahead, his knuckles resting on the table. A young aide leaned in to whisper, but he didn't respond. Representative Daniel Carver leaned toward Representative Thomas Reed across the table, their eyes meeting briefly, uncertain. It wasn't just a voicemail. It was Jasmine. Her stillness, her precision, her refusal to raise her voice. It hit harder than any speech they'd heard in months. At the back, a staffer scribbled in a notebook. 2 others exchanged glances, one mouthing a quiet wow. Ivanka sat still, her face pale, her polished mask beginning to crack. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low. "Representative Crockett's response has been noted for the record. The panel will resume the scheduled review." But no one was ready to move on. The air had changed, and Jasmine sat at the table, flipping a page in her binder, her face unreadable. The hearing continued, but the room was no longer just listening. It was watching, waiting, recalculating. And Jasmine? She was already preparing for what came next. The hearing room emptied slowly, chairs scraping as panelists and aides gathered their things. The formal agenda trudged forward, but the rhythm was off, like a song that had lost its beat. Representative Marcus Hale read the next item on the docket, his voice flat, but no one was really listening. Eyes kept drifting to Jasmine Crockett, who sat calmly, flipping through her binder, and to Ivanka Trump, who remained at the back, her posture stiff, her face a careful mask of neutrality. The room was still processing, still reeling from the voicemail that had turned a routine ethics review into something else entirely. Jasmine didn't rush to leave when the session broke for a 10-minute recess. She stayed seated, her aide, Lena Carter, a sharp-witted woman from Houston, leaning in close. "You sure you want to hang back?" Lena whispered, her eyes scanning the room. "Reporters are circling the hallway like vultures." Jasmine shook her head, her voice low. "Let them circle. We didn't leak that recording. We played it where it mattered here." She closed her binder with a soft snap and took a sip of water, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Outside, the hallway buzzed with a different energy. Panelists trickled out, some heading for restrooms, others pacing with phones pressed to their ears. Ivanka moved in the opposite direction, her steps quick, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She avoided eye contact, her lips pressed thin. By the time she reached the side exit, it was too late. The voicemail was out. No one knew exactly how it happened. Maybe an aide had recorded it against the rules. Maybe the mutual contact who'd shared the voicemail with Jasmine had decided to go public. Maybe a staffer's careless text had landed in the wrong hands. It didn't matter. By the time Ivanka stepped into the humid D.C. air, the 45-second clip was already ricocheting across 3 news blogs and had been reposted on X by a political strategist with a caption, "Truth hurts, doesn't it?" Reporters swarmed near the sidewalk, their questions slicing through the air. MS. "Trump, did you send that voicemail? Why praise Crockett privately and criticize her publicly? Was this coordinated?" No answers came, just the sharp rhythm of her heels hitting the pavement, a little too fast. Inside, Jasmine finally stood, gathering her things with the same calm she'd carried all day. Lena walked beside her as they headed toward a side hallway, away from the press. "It's out," Lena said, holding up her phone. The screen showed a news alert with the voicemail already trending. Jasmine glanced at it, her expression unchanged. She said, her shoulders loosening slightly, her jaw softening. It wasn't relief, not exactly, just the quiet confidence of someone who'd played their hand and walked away clean. They turned a corner into a quieter hallway, heading for the parking lot where a black SUV waited. That's when Jasmine saw him. Representative Harold Vance, the oldest member of the committee, a grizzled conservative with a reputation for saying little unless it mattered. He stood by a vending machine, slowly twisting the cap off a water bottle. When he saw Jasmine, he paused, then walked toward her with careful steps. "Representative Crockett," he said, his voice low, gravelly. She stopped. Lena's grip on her phone tightened. "Congressman," Jasmine replied, her tone even. Vance straightened his tie, his eyes steady. "I won't pretend we've ever seen eye to eye. I've said things about your style I wouldn't repeat today." He paused, choosing his words. "But I've sat through more hearings than I care to count, and today was the first time in years I saw someone handle a blindside without blinking." Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face. "You saying that for yourself? Or for the record?" He gave a half-smile, rare for him. "Both." He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. Lena glanced at Jasmine, her eyebrows raised. "That was unexpected." "Yeah," Jasmine said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But I'll take it." By the time they reached the SUV, the voicemail clip had gone beyond viral. Someone had paired it with a split screen of Ivanka's hearing statement, the contrast brutal in its clarity. Social media was ablaze, with comments flooding in. She played her own words back to her. Ice cold. Jasmine didn't even raise her voice. That's power. Inside the vehicle, Jasmine sank into the seat, her eyes fixed on the window as the city blurred past. Lena handed her a charger and opened her tablet, scrolling through the growing commentary. "You're trending," she said. "Even folks who don't agree with you are saying you handled it with class." Jasmine didn't look up. I wasn't trying to trend, she said quietly. I was trying to survive the day with my dignity. Lena grinned. Well, you did that and then some. But the clip wasn't just a moment. It was starting a conversation no one could control. By evening, newsrooms were dissecting it, talk shows were looping it, and political analysts were breaking it down like a play-by-play. The narrative wasn't just about the voicemail anymore. It was about Jasmine, her restraint, her precision, her ability to turn attack into a mirror. And that mirror was reflecting something people hadn't expected. 2 months earlier, in a community center parking lot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Jasmine had been wiping sweat from her brow after a long town hall. The crowd had been small but vocal. Parents, shop owners, retirees, all asking the same question in different ways. Who's fighting for us? She was exhausted, not just physically but mentally, the kind of tired that settles into your bones when you've been carrying other people's hopes for too long. She was tossing a napkin into a trash when Marcus Tate, a civil rights attorney with deep connections across both parties, approached her. You keep swinging like that, you're going to need better armor, he said, nodding toward the building. Jasmine chuckled, her voice hoarse. Better armor? I need a backup throat. Marcus reached into his pocket and handed her a phone. Not hers, his. The voicemail screen was open. What's this? She asked. Something you might want to keep, he said. He hit play. It was Ivanka's voice, soft, unguarded. I know she makes people nervous, but Jasmine's the real deal. She's one of the only ones up there actually fighting for people. Not headlines, not donors. She's fierce. I wish more were like her. Jasmine listened, her face still. Marcus watched her closely. She left that for Clara Reed. You both know her from that housing panel in Phoenix last year. Clara shared it with me because she thought you should hear it. And I think you should hold on to it. Jasmine handed the phone back. Marcus, I'm not in the business of collecting compliments, especially not from people who play both sides. He pressed the phone back into her palm. Just don't delete it. Not every fight's loud, Jasmine. Some creeping quiet, sideways. You'll know when to use it. She didn't argue. 2 weeks later, she copied the voicemail to her own phone, not because she planned to use it, but because Marcus was rarely wrong. Deep down, she knew politics wasn't about truth. It was about what you could prove when the moment came. Still, she told herself, I'm not that kind of politician. But the signs were there. Panel members growing distant, conversations turning guarded, colleagues she'd worked with suddenly slow to respond. Someone was laying groundwork, and she felt it coming. She just hadn't expected Ivanka. They'd never been friends, but there had been moments of mutual respect. At a fundraiser in Dallas, Ivanka had once asked her, how do you keep that fire going? Jasmine had answered, because if I don't burn, nothing moves. Ivanka had smiled then, a real smile. Now, that same woman had tried to paint her as reckless, dangerous, unfit. It wasn't just politics, it was personal. That's why Jasmine had prepped the voicemail, not as a weapon, but as a shield. Lena had been skeptical. You sure this won't look petty? She'd asked. Jasmine's response was firm. If I scream, they'll say I'm angry. If I say nothing, they'll say I folded. This is neither. This is her truth in her voice. Now, as the SUV rolled through DC's evening traffic, Jasmine watched the city lights flicker past. The clip was spreading, and with it, a shift in how people saw her. Lena scrolled through her tablet, reading out posts. This one says, Jasmine Crockett just redefined clapback. This one's from a conservative account. Didn't expect to respect her today, but damn. Jasmine didn't smile. They're not respecting me, she said. They're respecting the receipts. But it was more than that. The voicemail had cracked open a door, and through it, people were starting to see her work, her record, her fight. By nightfall, the clip was everywhere. News channels, social media, even late-night comedians slipping her line, this isn't about image, it's about impact, into their monologues. Jasmine didn't watch any of it. She sat in her hotel room in Arlington, the lights low, her phone face down next to a bowl of untouched strawberries. Lena had gone home after confirming tomorrow's schedule. Jasmine had turned down 4 interviews, including a primetime slot. Let the clip speak, she told her team. People don't need me to explain it. They need to sit with it. But the country was talking. In diners in Boise, barbershops in Memphis, coffee shops in Tucson, people were pulling out their phones, playing the clip, asking each other, "You hear this?" It wasn't just the voicemail. It was Jasmine's calm, her patience, the way she'd let the truth do the work. In Birmingham, a high school teacher played it for her civics class, saying, "This is how you hold power without shouting." In Seattle, a young man posted a video of his grandmother watching the clip, tears in her eyes, the caption reading, "She reminds me of my mom, who never got credit either." Back in her hotel room, Jasmine flipped on the TV. A cable news panel was dissecting her response. She didn't just survive that attack, one pundit said. She turned it into a spotlight. Another nodded. Ivanka's team is scrambling now. They didn't see this coming. Jasmine muted the volume and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The Capitol dome glowed in the distance, stark against the night sky. Her phone buzzed. Her mother, calling from Dallas. She answered on speaker. "Hey, Mama. You looked calm," her mother said, skipping any greeting. "But I know that face. You were mad." "I wasn't mad," Jasmine said softly. "I was tired." "Well," her mother replied, "you turned tired into truth." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that felt full, not empty. "I'm proud of you," her mother added. "I know," Jasmine said. "Thank you." She hung up and stared out at the city again. She didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel vindicated. She felt awake. Something had shifted, not just in that room, not just online, but in how people were starting to see her. She wasn't just the loud one, the fiery one. She was a woman with a record, with work, with a fire that burned steady, not wild. And people were beginning to respect that. She sat at the small desk in her room, pulled out a notepad, and wrote one word: momentum. She underlined it twice. This wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. But what came next would test whether that momentum could hold, or whether it would fade into just another viral moment. The week after the hearing felt like the ground had shifted beneath Jasmine Crockett's feet, a sensation somewhere between soaring and stumbling. Her inbox overflowed with messages, journalists digging for quotes, activists offering support, everyday people sending notes of gratitude. One email from a retiree in Oklahoma stood out. "I've never written to a politician before, but you made me feel like my voice matters." Jasmine forwarded it to Lena Carter, her aide, with a single word: real. She didn't let the noise pull her off course. On Friday, she stood before the Dallas Transportation Board, arguing for sidewalk expansion in underserved neighborhoods, her voice steady, her facts sharp, as if Twitter didn't exist. That same night, she flew back to D.C. for a late meeting with representatives from both parties about a housing pilot program for single mothers. She didn't mention the voicemail, didn't reference the hearing. Her silence on the matter wasn't avoidance. It was discipline. And that discipline, that refusal to lean into the spotlight, earned her quiet nods of respect from colleagues who'd once dismissed her as too brash. By Monday, the media frenzy hadn't slowed. CNN ran a segment calling her response a masterclass in political poise. A Dallas radio station looped the voicemail clip every morning, pairing it with listener calls praising her restraint. Even skeptics, those who'd criticized her blunt style, began to shift. A conservative blogger posted, "I don't agree with her politics, but you can't deny her record. She's got receipts." The conversation was changing, moving beyond the drama to the substance of her work. But the moment that hit hardest came quietly, not from a headline, but from a letter. It arrived at her D.C. office in a plain envelope, no return address, just her name in shaky handwriting. Inside, a typed note: "Ms. Crockett, I've followed Congress for 30 years. Your hearing was the first time I saw someone stand on truth without tearing the other side down. You didn't shame Ms. Trump. You held her to her own words. I taught history in a small Ohio school for 20 years. I'll share your response with my students next semester, not for the politics, but for the character. Keep going. EM." Jasmine read it 3 times, then tucked it into the front flap of her binder. The viral posts, the TV segments, they'd fade. But this quiet respect from someone who'd seen her not as a soundbite, but as a person, that stayed with her. It reminded her why she'd run for office. Not for applause, not for power, but to make truth visible in a world that often buried it under polished lies. She carried that letter with her to a university forum in San Antonio later that week. The room was packed, students, professors, local organizers, all buzzing with questions about the hearing. She answered them briefly, redirecting to her work. The Urban Policing Reform Act, the Rural Education Equity Package, the Clean Access Corridor Plan for lead pipe removal. When a student asked how she stayed calm under attack, she paused, then said, "You don't stay calm. You prepare. When the moment comes, your truth speaks for you." The room went quiet, not stunned, but thoughtful, like they were hearing something they'd carry with them. At the end of her speech, she added a line she hadn't planned. "I don't care if people remember my name. I care if they remember how to hold power accountable without losing themselves." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that meant people were listening, really listening. A young woman in the front row, clutching a notebook, nodded slowly, her eyes bright with something like recognition. Back in D.C., the Capitol hallways were quieter by evening, the echo of footsteps trailing behind staffers packing up for the day. Jasmine had just left a meeting on an environmental infrastructure project. Nothing headline-worthy, just steady work on green spaces for low-income districts. As she stepped out of the side elevator, she saw Representative Edward Lorne waiting outside her office. Tall, gray-haired, with a reputation for sticking to bipartisan pleasantries, Lorne had once called her too confrontational in a closed-door meeting. Now he stood there, hands in his pockets, looking almost sheepish. "Congresswoman," he said, nodding as she approached. "Edward," she replied, her tone neutral, studying him. He cleared his throat. "I wanted a word, if you've got a minute." She gestured for him to speak. He glanced down the hall, then back at her. "I didn't agree with what Ms. Trump tried to do. It didn't sit right, trying to paint you as something you're not. I've disagreed with your approach plenty, but your record, it's hard to argue with." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "We've worked on 2 bills together, Edward. You barely spoke to me." He nodded, almost wincing. "I have my biases. I'm working on that. What you did in that hearing, how you handled it, that was something, made me rethink a few things." He paused, then added, "If you need a co-sponsor on that mental health clinic bill, I'm in." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll hold you to that." He gave a small smile, then walked off, his steps lighter than when he'd approached. Lena stepped out of the office, catching the tail end of the conversation. 2 in 1 week, she said, smirking. "You collecting apologies now?" Jasmine shook her head, a faint grin breaking through. "Not apologies. Progress." Inside her office, the desk was buried under housing proposals, mental health outreach plans, and a brief on the School Clean Water Act she'd been pushing for months. Lena handed her a coffee and a printout of the day's media coverage. "Austin Outlet just dropped a feature on your legislative work," she said, titled it Beyond the Voicemail. What Jasmine Crockett has actually done. Lists every bill, every vote, every coalition. People are reading it. Jasmine glanced at the printout, then set it aside. Good. Let them read the receipts. She wasn't chasing the spotlight, but it was finding her. By midweek, a local radio station in Houston invited her for an interview. They wanted to talk about the voicemail, but she pivoted, laying out her district's unemployment rates, the need for mobile clinics, the fight for clean water in schools. The host, caught off guard, said that's the clearest breakdown of district impact we've had on air in years. Off air, an intern called later, her voice shaky. "My mom heard you talk about the school water filters." She cried, said no one's ever made her feel seen like that. Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment. "Tell your mom she was seen," she said. "That's why I'm here." The clip was still everywhere. Cable news, social media, even a late-night comedian quoting her. This isn't about image, it's about impact. But Jasmine wasn't watching. She was working. In just over a year, she'd co-sponsored 11 bills, 6 of which cleared committee. She'd held joint town halls in Lubbock and Fresno with Republicans who barely spoke to each other, let alone her. She'd fought to restore funding for a food access program in rural Arkansas, making the case on the House floor, and in local papers to ensure her constituents knew who'd tried to cut their resources. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. In Fort Worth, where she held listening sessions at a laundromat every other Friday, people didn't want polished speeches. They wanted someone who showed up, who fought. Like the time she stayed past midnight in the Capitol, hammering out a compromise to keep mobile clinics running. Or when she flew back to Dallas 3 days after her brother's funeral to meet with organizers about eviction rates. No one tweeted about that, but it mattered. Now, because of one voicemail, people were starting to see it. The Austin feature spread, picked up by blogs, then national outlets. For once, the story wasn't just her tone or her fire. It was her work, her results, her impact. And that shift, small but seismic, was rippling beyond D.C. By Thursday, another message came through, this one from Representative Sarah Klein, a junior panelist who'd once called Jasmine too abrasive in a private meeting. The email was short. If you're still pushing that mental health funding bill, I'm on board. Let's talk. Lena raised an eyebrow as she read it aloud. That's 3, she said. You sure you don't want a parade? Jasmine laughed, the sound tired but genuine. Don't jinx it. Her phone rang. Line 2, press office. She picked it up. Crockett. Congresswoman, it's Mara from KTXL Radio, the voice said. Your segment this morning was electric. Listeners are still calling in. One said you made policy sound human, like it's not just numbers. Mara paused. Also, off the record, my producer's mom heard you talk about community health access. She said it felt like you were speaking directly to her. Jasmine leaned back in her chair. Tell her I was, she said softly. She hung up, her eyes drifting to the letter from EM, still tucked in her binder. Not every win was loud. Some came in quiet moments, hallway nods, emails from colleagues, letters from strangers. Those were the ones that fueled her. Outside, the media churned, the clips still looping, the narrative still shifting. But Jasmine was already looking ahead, her pen scratching notes for her next meeting. The ripple was spreading, and she knew it. The question was whether it would grow into something lasting or fade like every other viral moment. The ripple that began in the hearing room didn't fade. It grew, spreading far beyond the marble halls of D.C., past the cable news loops and X posts, into places where politics wasn't just a headline, but a lifeline. Jasmine Crockett felt it, not in the noise of the media, but in the quiet moments. The emails from strangers, the nods from colleagues, the way her district's voices seemed to carry a little further. She wasn't chasing the spotlight, but it followed her, illuminating the work she'd been doing all along. By the following Monday, the voicemail clip had become more than a viral moment. It was a catalyst. Local papers from Houston to Little Rock ran features on Jasmine's legislative record, detailing her work on housing, clean water, and mental health access. A community organizer in Tulsa sent her a photo of a handwritten sign at a town hall, Truth Over Optics. A college professor in Austin emailed, asking to use her hearing response in a civics course, calling it a lesson in integrity under pressure. Jasmine saved that one, tucking it into her mental file of things that mattered. She kept moving. Tuesday found her in Dallas, meeting with local health officials about expanding mobile clinics. Wednesday, she was back in D.C., sitting across from 2 Republican representatives to hammer out details on a bipartisan education equity bill. She didn't mention the hearing, didn't lean into the buzz. But it was there, in the way people listened a little closer, nodded a little quicker. Even those who'd once dismissed her as too loud now seemed to weigh her words differently. In her office late one evening, the lights low and the Capitol dome glowing faintly through the window, Jasmine sat with Lena Carter, her aide, sorting through a stack of policy briefs. Lena scrolled through her tablet, reading out the latest. NPR did a piece on you today, she said. Called you the calm in the storm. They're saying your response shifted how people talk about accountability. Jasmine didn't look up from her notes. They're not talking about accountability, she said. They're talking about drama. Accountability doesn't trend. Lena smirked. Maybe, but they're also listing your bills, everyone you've pushed through or co-sponsored. That's new. Jasmine paused, her pen hovering over a page. That's something. she said softly. She leaned back, her eyes drifting to the letter from EM, still tucked in her binder. It wasn't the headlines that kept her going. It was the teacher in Ohio, the retiree in Oklahoma, the mother in Houston who'd felt seen. Those were the anchors. The next day, as she walked through the Capitol's second-floor hallway, she ran into Representative Clara Monroe, a moderate who'd once described Jasmine's style as divisive in a committee meeting. Clara stopped, her expression hesitant but open. "Jasmine," she said, "I owe you a conversation." Jasmine tilted her head. "Go on." Clara shifted, clutching a folder. "I misjudged you. I thought your approach was too much. But after the hearing, I looked at your record. The housing pilot, the water filters, the way you got that food access program through. You're doing the work. I want it on the mental health bill, not just as a co-sponsor. I want to help push it." Jasmine studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's set a meeting. Bring your team." Lena, trailing behind, whispered as they walked away, "That's 4. You're building a coalition without even trying." Jasmine cracked a smile. "I'm always trying, just not for the applause." The momentum wasn't just in D.C. It was in the barbershops of Memphis, where men debated her response over clippers buzzing. It was in the community centers of Phoenix, where organizers played the clip to spark discussions about truth in politics. It was in the text between friends in Raleigh, one saying, "She didn't just win, she showed us how to fight without losing yourself." But momentum is fragile. Jasmine knew it. By Friday, the media had started to move on, chasing a new scandal, a new soundbite. Ivanka Trump's name faded from the headlines, her team issuing a vague statement about misunderstandings and moving forward. Jasmine didn't care. She hadn't played the voicemail to destroy anyone. She'd played it to defend her truth. And that truth was still standing. At a community event in Fort Worth that weekend, held in a rec center gym that smelled faintly of sweat and pine cleaner, Jasmine stood before a crowd of parents, teachers, and small business owners. They didn't ask about the voicemail. They asked about jobs, about healthcare, about schools. She answered each question, her voice clear, her facts ready. When a woman in the back, her hair wrapped in a bright scarf, asked how Jasmine kept going when they keep coming for you, she paused, then said, "You don't keep going because it's easy. You keep going because it's necessary. And you keep good people close, people who remind you who you are." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. The room clapped, not loudly, but deeply, the kind of applause that comes from recognition, not performance. Back in her hotel room that night, Jasmine sat alone, her phone off, the TV dark. She opened her notepad, where momentum was still underlined. Beneath it, she wrote, "Don't let's stop." She thought about the work still ahead, the bills stuck in committee, the communities still waiting for clean water, the families still fighting evictions. The hearing had been a moment, but moments don't change systems. Work does. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a text from Lena. "Check your email. You're not going to believe this." Attached was a message from a retired judge in Atlanta, a man who'd served 30 years on the bench. Representative Crockett, it read, "I've seen a lot of hearings, a lot of posturing. What you did was different. You didn't just defend yourself. You defended what truth looks like. I'm sharing your story with my grandchildren. They need to know what principle looks like in action." Echt. Jasmine read it twice, then set her phone down. She didn't reply, didn't forward it. She just let it sit, heavy and real. Later that day, at a small D.C. coffee shop, she met with a group of young organizers working on voter turnout in underserved districts. They didn't want to talk about the hearing. They wanted her advice on coalition building. She gave it, laying out strategies she'd learned the hard way. Listen first, push second, and never let ego outrun impact. As the meeting wrapped, one of the organizers, a young woman with braids and a nervous smile, lingered. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "How do you know when you're making a difference? Like really making one?" Jasmine leaned forward, her voice low. "When people start seeing themselves in the fight, not just you, not just your name, but what you're fighting for. That's when you know." The woman nodded, her smile steadying. "Thanks," she said. "I'm going to remember that." By the next week, the voicemail was old news, replaced by the usual churn of political outrage. But something lingered. Jasmine's name carried a different weight now, not just in headlines, but in quieter spaces, classrooms, community centers, living rooms where people were starting to ask, what's she working on next? Her office phone rang more often, not with reporters, but with colleagues offering to collaborate, community leaders asking for her input, strangers sharing stories of how her work had touched their lives. She didn't let it go to her head. At a late-night strategy session with Lena, she laid out her next steps: a push for the mental health bill, a new proposal for job training programs, a coalition to address rural broadband access. "They're paying attention now," she told Lena, her voice steady. "Let's make it count." Lena grinned. "You're not just riding momentum, you're building it." Jasmine didn't smile, but her eyes were bright. "Good, because we're not done." And they weren't. The hearing had been a spark, the voicemail a mirror, but the real work was what came after. Jasmine Crockett wasn't aiming to be a celebrity or a brand. She wanted to be a line in a history book under a chapter called Integrity in Action. Not for her name, but for what it stood for. Truth held steady, spoken clearly, backed by receipts. She'd shown the world that a fight didn't need to be loud to be powerful, that a clapback didn't need to wound to win. And as she moved forward, meeting by meeting, bill by bill, she carried that momentum, knowing the real test wasn't in going viral. It was in making change that lasted. In a quiet moment, alone in her office, she pulled out the letter from EM and read it again. Then she tucked it back in her binder, next to a new note she'd written: "Keep going." Because that's what truth did. It kept going, steady and unyielding, until the world had no choice but to listen.